I never thought family could be so cruel, but sometimes the people you trust the most are the ones who hurt you the deepest. My sister wasn't just jealous of me. She hated me in a way I didn't understand until the night she locked me inside a freezer. Imagine being trapped in a pitch-dark box, your breath turning to white mist, your fingers stiff and useless, your heart pounding as the minutes crawl by. Every second feels like an eternity. The cold burns first, then numbs, and finally, it begins to swallow you whole. My screams echoed inside the icy metal walls, but no one came. My own sister had shut me in, and as I pounded on the frozen steel, I realized she wanted me gone. But what she didn't know was that I am not as weak as she thinks. Surviving something like that changes you forever. It makes you see life differently, it makes you see people differently. And now, after everything she did to me, the tables have turned. I'm the one holding the power. I'm the one who decides her fate. This isn't just a story about betrayal. It's about survival, revenge, and a twisted bond that blood alone can't break. Family doesn't always mean love. Sometimes it means war. And when your own blood turns against you, you learn quickly that survival isn't about mercy. It's about strength. She left me to die in the cold, but I came back burning hotter than fire itself. And now, she will understand exactly what it feels like to be trapped, helpless, and afraid. My sister was the kind of person who could smile in front of others and make them believe she was the sweetest soul alive. But when the doors closed and there was no one around, I often saw the shadows in her eyes. Shadows that were made of envy, bitterness, and a kind of coldness I could never quite understand. Growing up, I thought it was just sibling rivalry. After all, most brothers and sisters fight over silly things like clothes, toys, or who gets the last piece of cake. But as the years passed, her anger toward me seemed to grow instead of fade, and it wasn't about toys or food anymore. It was about me existing in her world as someone she thought stole all the attention. Teachers praised me for my grades, relatives compared her to me in family gatherings, and neighbors often told our parents how polite and hardworking I was, while she would stand to the side, her lips pressed tight, her eyes narrowing as if each compliment directed at me was another wound being carved into her pride. I tried to ignore it, even comfort her at times, but my kindness was not what she wanted. She wanted me gone, erased, forgotten, so that she could finally stand in the light that she believed belonged only to her. That night at our uncle's warehouse, I didn't realize how deep her hatred had already grown, and how far she was willing to go to make her wish come true. She asked me so casually, almost cheerfully, if I could help her with some heavy boxes that had been stored inside the industrial freezer, saying she couldn't lift them alone and needed my strength. I didn't think twice because helping her felt natural, as though maybe she was finally letting down her walls and allowing me to be useful to her instead of her enemy. The warehouse was dimly lit, the buzzing sound of fluorescent lights humming overhead, and the air smelled of dust, oil, and something faintly metallic. When we reached the freezer, I felt a wave of icy air spill out the moment she pulled the heavy door open, and I shivered as I stepped inside. The shelves were stacked with frozen goods, wrapped in plastic, and the walls glistened faintly with frost. I turned back to her, smiling lightly, asking where the boxes were, but her face wasn't smiling anymore. It was unreadable, cold, as if she had already made up her mind and nothing could change it. Before I could process what was happening, she gripped the handle from the outside and with one swift motion, she slammed the door shut. The heavy metal clanged like a death bell, and the sound echoed inside my chest, making my heart stutter. For a split second I thought it was a joke, that she would laugh and open the door again, but then I heard it, the sharp click of the lock snapping into place, sealing me inside. My fists slammed against the steel, my voice rose in panic, shouting her name, demanding she open the door, but all I heard was silence. Then, faintly, a sound that made my blood run colder than the freezing air around me. A laugh. Not loud, not hysterical, just a quiet, satisfied laugh, muffled through the door, before her footsteps retreated and I realized she was really leaving me there. At first, I screamed until my throat burned, my fists pounding so hard that my knuckles began to sting, but the freezer swallowed my cries, making them sound small, weak, as though even the walls didn't care about my suffering. My breath turned to mist, swirling in front of my face as the temperature bit into my skin, the cold sneaking beneath my clothes and gnawing at my bones. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours, and each second carved away at my strength. My body shivered violently, my teeth chattered uncontrollably, and the tips of my fingers began to go numb, making it harder to keep pounding on the door. My thoughts scattered, tumbling between disbelief and terror, between memories of when we were children and moments where she held my hand, laughed with me, and even hugged me, and now the horrifying truth that the same sister had just left me to die. Why? The question pounded louder than my fists. Why did she hate me this much? What had I done that was so unforgivable? I pressed my forehead against the cold steel, tears spilling from my eyes only to freeze against my cheeks, and for the first time, I felt what it truly meant to be powerless. In the dark silence, I thought of my parents, of how they would react when they discovered my frozen body, and of how my sister would probably act innocent, pretending to cry, pretending to be shocked. The image of her crocodile tears made my stomach twist with rage, and that tiny spark of anger was the only warmth I had in that moment. I promised myself I would not let her win, not let her erase me so easily. I pressed my hands together, trying to create friction, anything to keep the blood moving, and I forced myself to breathe slow, steady, even though every breath felt like knives cutting through my lungs. Time blurred. I don't know how long I stayed in that nightmare, but I remember the way my body began to feel heavy, my eyelids drooping, my mind slipping toward a dangerous calmness, as if sleep would make the pain go away. But sleep meant death, and I wasn't ready to die. Not like this, not by her hands. Summoning the last fragments of my strength, I banged one more time, a weak thud that echoed faintly, and then by some miracle I heard it. The sound of footsteps, different from hers, heavier, hurried. The door creaked open, and a burst of light blinded me, warm air rushing against my frozen skin. A worker stood there, his eyes wide with horror as he saw me collapse to the ground, barely conscious. I remember his arms lifting me, voices shouting, the blur of movement as I was carried out, but most of all, I remember one clear thought that burned in my mind through the fog of my half-frozen body. She wanted me dead, but I was still alive. And if I survived this, my sister would one day know that the power she thought she had over me was gone, and that the fate she had chosen for me was the very same fate she would one day face herself. When I woke up, the world was blurred and muffled, as though I was underwater, and it took me several moments to realize I wasn't dead but lying in a hospital bed with a thin blanket pulled over me, warm air pressing gently against my skin from a heater at the corner of the room. My lips were cracked, my fingers still stiff, and my entire body felt like it belonged to someone else, heavy and uncooperative, but I was alive, and that single truth sent a ripple of relief through my fogged mind. Nurses moved around me, adjusting 4 lines, whispering words I couldn't fully understand, and a doctor leaned over me with tired but kind eyes, telling me I had hypothermia, that I had been found just in time, and that if the worker had been even half an hour late, I wouldn't be here to hear his voice. His words landed on me like weights, not because I was shocked about how close I had come to death, but because I already knew exactly who had put me there and why. When my parents rushed into the room, their faces pale with fear, they asked me what had happened, how I ended up inside a locked freezer, and for a moment I considered telling them the truth, exposing her for what she had done, but when I opened my mouth, no words came out. My throat was dry, my voice barely a whisper, and more than that, something inside me told me this wasn't the right time. If I accused her now, she would twist the story, cry in front of them, claim it was an accident or that I was lying, and somehow they would pity her instead of me. That's what she was best at, playing the innocent victim while I looked like the cold, cruel one. So I stayed silent, murmured something about wandering in by mistake, about the door shutting behind me, and the doctor nodded with concern, while my parents looked at each other with relief that it wasn't something worse, and all the while I could feel my sister's presence standing at the back of the room. She didn't rush forward to hug me, didn't cry like a normal sibling would after almost losing a brother or sister. She stood stiffly, her arms crossed loosely over her chest, her face carefully arranged into a mask of sorrow, but her eyes betrayed her. They were wide and restless, flickering with something between shock and disbelief, as though she couldn't accept that I had survived what she had planned. For the briefest second, our eyes locked, and in that silence I spoke to her without words. "I know it was you." She shifted uncomfortably, breaking the stare, pretending to look at the floor, and I knew then that I had gained something she never expected me to have, power. My recovery was slow, the hospital becoming a strange cocoon where I had too much time to think. At night, when the ward quieted down, I would stare at the ceiling and replay everything in my mind, from the sound of the door slamming shut to the frozen silence where I thought my life was ending, and instead of weakening me, it hardened me. Fear transformed into anger, anger into resolve. I told myself that survival wasn't just about getting my strength back. It was about preparing for the moment I would confront her, not with childish accusations, but with a presence so unshakable she would never forget who I had become. Nurses said I was lucky, but luck wasn't what saved me, it was will. Days turned into weeks, and eventually I was discharged. My body still carrying the stiffness of the cold, but my mind sharper than ever. Coming home was strange. Everything looked the same, smelled the same, but I was no longer the same person who had walked into that freezer. My parents fussed over me, asking if I needed anything, trying to make me comfortable, and my sister acted as though nothing had ever happened. She set the table for dinner, laughed when the television showed something funny, and even asked me casually if I was feeling better. Her tone so perfectly normal that anyone else would believe she was a caring sister. But I heard the slight tremor in her voice, saw how her hands shook just a little when she passed me a glass of water, and I knew that beneath her mask, she was terrified. That night, when everyone else had gone to sleep, I stood at the doorway of her room, watching her pretend to be at ease as she scrolled through her phone, but her shoulders were tense, her body stiff. She looked up suddenly, startled to see me there, and for a moment we just stared at each other, silence stretching between us like a wire pulled tight. I smiled faintly, not out of warmth but out of calculation, and whispered, "Thank you for visiting me at the hospital." My voice steady, calm, layered with a meaning only she could hear. Her lips parted slightly, her throat bobbing as she swallowed, and she nodded quickly before looking away, unable to meet my gaze. That was all I needed. She knew that I knew. The following days were filled with small battles, unspoken but powerful. At breakfast, I would catch her staring at me from the corner of her eye, searching for signs that I might expose her, and I would simply eat quietly, unbothered, letting the tension gnaw at her instead of me. When relatives came over and asked about my hospital stay, I gave vague answers, but my sister would grow restless, her laughter too loud, her explanations too quick, as though she was desperately trying to control the story before I could twist it against her. But I didn't need to twist anything. The truth sat heavy between us, invisible to everyone else but burning like fire every time our eyes met. At night, I thought about the promise I had made to myself inside that freezer, that she would one day feel what I felt, not just the physical cold, but the despair of knowing someone you trust once you're gone. I didn't know yet how or when, but I knew it was inevitable. For now, I let her drown in her own paranoia. Let her wonder if I would tell our parents, if I would go to the police, if I would ruin her carefully constructed image. That uncertainty was my weapon, and I wielded it with silence sharper than any blade. The more she tried to act normal, the more cracks appeared in her performance, and the more I could see her unraveling. And in that unraveling I found strength. I was no longer her victim. I was the survivor who had returned, not broken, but forged into something new, something she would never be able to control again. She had left me in the cold, but I had come back burning with a fire she couldn't extinguish, and deep down, she knew her fate was no longer in her own hands. It was in mine. The days that followed my return to normal life felt anything but normal, because even though my parents carried on as if everything was fine, even though the world outside still spun with its usual rhythm, inside our house there was a constant, invisible storm brewing between me and my sister. She tried so hard to pretend nothing had happened, tried to mask the tension with fake laughter and casual remarks, but I saw through every act, and I could tell she was slowly suffocating under the weight of her own secret. It wasn't just guilt, though guilt might have played a small part. It was fear, the kind of fear that eats at you from the inside, gnaws at your nerves, keeps you awake at night wondering if today is the day the truth finally comes out. And I made sure to feed that fear. I never confronted her directly, never accused her openly, but I became her shadow, moving silently, watching, letting her feel my presence at the edges of every room we shared. Sometimes I would linger in the hallway as she passed, my eyes fixed on her until she fumbled with her phone or her cup, pretending not to notice me. Other times, I would catch her alone in the kitchen and simply ask her how she was doing, my voice calm, steady, but my gaze unblinking, making her stammer a quick answer before escaping as fast as she could. Every small encounter was a reminder that I was still here, still alive, and that I knew what she had done. At night, I could hear her pacing her room, restless footsteps back and forth across the floorboards, and sometimes I would knock gently on the wall between our rooms, a soft sound that could easily be mistaken for coincidence but never was. She would stop moving immediately, silence hanging heavy for minutes, and I would smile in the dark, knowing she was lying in her bed with wide eyes, wondering if I was awake, if I was planning something. What she didn't know was that yes, I was planning something, but not in the way she probably imagined. I wasn't rushing to the police or spilling the truth to our parents because that would have been too easy for her. She could cry, twist the story, maybe even get away with it. No, I wanted something more precise, something personal. A punishment that would strike not her reputation but her soul, one that would make her taste the same fear and helplessness I had felt inside that freezer. So I started to watch her more closely, not just her behavior at home but her routines, her habits, her vulnerabilities. I noticed how she hated being in the dark, how she always left the hallway light on when going to bed, how she checked the locks on the doors twice before finally sleeping, how she jumped at sudden noises when she thought no one was watching. She was already unraveling, her paranoia growing roots, and all I needed to do was nurture it, water it with small, subtle touches until she could barely tell the difference between reality and imagination. Sometimes when she was in the shower, I would quietly move something in her room. A book she left on the desk shifted slightly, a drawer pulled half open, her jewelry box tilted just enough for her to notice. She would return, freeze in place as her eyes scanned the changes, and then she would quickly fix them, her hands trembling, her breaths shallow. Another time, I turned off the hallway light after she went to bed, knowing she would wake in the dark, and sure enough, I heard her door creak open minutes later, her hurried footsteps as she switched it back on, muttering under her breath as though scolding herself. Each of these little games was my way of giving her back what she had given me, a sense of not being safe in her own world. But it wasn't just about scaring her. It was about preparing her for the lesson, the moment when she would finally understand what true fear felt like, not in glimpses, but in its full, suffocating weight. The freezer had nearly taken my life, but it had also given me a gift: clarity. It had shown me who my sister really was, stripped her of every illusion, and now I had the chance to show her who I had become. I began spending more time at the warehouse where it had all happened, under the pretense of helping our uncle with extra work. The first time I stepped back into that place, the smell of oil and cold air hit me like a punch, memories flooding back so sharp I had to pause at the door just to steady myself. But instead of breaking me, the memories fueled me. I walked to the freezer, placed my hand on the cold steel door, and whispered to myself that this was no longer a place of death. It was going to be my stage. Over the next few visits, I familiarized myself with every inch of it. How the door sounded when it shut, how long it took for the cold to seep in, where the lock could be engaged, and even where I could stand outside to hear the faintest noises from within. It wasn't just preparation. It was reclaiming power over the very space that had nearly stolen me. And all the while, back at home, my sister continued to wither under the invisible pressure I laid on her. Her grades slipped, she snapped at our parents for no reason. She stopped going out with her friends as often, preferring to lock herself in her room as though the world outside was too heavy to face. At dinner, she avoided my gaze, eating quickly, her hands trembling whenever our father asked her the simplest question. She was a house of cards, swaying with every subtle gust I sent her way, and I knew it was only a matter of time before she collapsed completely. One night, as I stood outside her room, I heard her crying softly, her muffled sobs breaking the silence, and instead of pity, I felt a cold satisfaction ripple through me. She was finally feeling the weight of fear, though she still didn't know what it truly meant. Not yet. I wanted her to experience the same isolation, the same suffocating cold, the same helplessness of knowing someone you trusted wanted you gone. And soon she would. I wasn't rushing because revenge wasn't something to take in haste. It was something to prepare, to savor, to deliver with precision. Every day that passed, she grew weaker, and I grew stronger, and when the time finally came, she would step into her own nightmare without even realizing it until the door slammed shut behind her. I invited her over on a Saturday, using the kind of casual voice that had become a weapon between us. Light, unbothered, like I hadn't spent months watching her unravel and planning every step of this night. She arrived wearing the same careless smile she used when she wanted people to think she was fine. Hair tucked behind one ear, hands twisting a strap of her bag as if nervousness might hide behind a practiced look. I asked her to come to the warehouse with me, saying Uncle needed help moving some boxes. She hesitated a beat, the micro-expression of suspicion flashing across her face, but then she shrugged and followed, probably thinking it was just another favor for family, another chore to prove she was useful. The drive there felt quiet and ordinary, the city a blur we were leaving behind, and I watched her in the rearview mirror as she fiddled with her phone, unaware of how carefully I had set the stage. When we stepped into the cold, dim cavern of the warehouse, the smell of oil and metal washed over us, but this time I didn't flinch. I had spent weeks coming here, learning the place with the slow, methodical patience of someone reclaiming what had almost taken their life. Uncle was there, nodding at us, busy with crates, and I let him think he was part of a simple errand while my sister relaxed a little, which was the only moment she would ever feel safe that night. I moved casually, joking about the uselessness of certain boxes, and she laughed, the sound brittle, a little too loud for comfort, and I could tell she was trying to convince herself the ordinary world still belonged to her. At some point I suggested we check the freezer, a mundane reason. Maybe an inventory count, maybe an old box we needed. And she went with me because she trusted the routine. Walk in, open the heavy door, see the frost. I kept my voice calm, offered to go first as if being polite, and when she stepped in to look for a misplaced crate, her posture relaxed in a way that made my chest tighten with something that was part sorrow and part cold resolve. I closed the door softly behind her, the metal making that familiar dull echo, and for a heartbeat I could see the play of confusion on her face as the reality of the place hit her. The frost at the corners, the sting of cold air, but before she could say anything I pressed the latch. I won't describe the mechanics, because this isn't a manual. This is the moment when roles reversed and the weight of choice landed on me. Her eyes widened, searching my face for a smile, for the answer, but I was emotionless, a steady presence that gave nothing away. The panic came slowly at first. Sharp intake of breath, the nervous laugh that tried to make the situation ridiculous, but then the real sound appeared, the kind of calling out that used to be a small, confident voice from a girl who believed the world owed her safety. It faltered into harsher notes as realization set in. For a few minutes I stood just outside in the dim light and listened. I could hear her moving inside, the rustle of clothing, the small thumps as she paced, the abrupt staccato of her breath when she banged once on the cold metal, testing whether the door would open. I did not answer. I allowed the cold to be the first teacher. It was what had almost finished me, and I wanted her to meet it as I had, unforgiving, indifferent. She called my name then, the way someone calls a name like it is a rope. I heard the break in her voice when she realized I wouldn't come running, that the rules of our childhood were gone. Outside, I lit a cigarette, though I had never smoked regularly. The motion was performative, a small humanizing act to make sure I didn't look like a monster, because I wasn't trying to kill her. I wanted her terrified, not broken beyond repair. She pounded the door harder, her nails scraping metal, and I imagined the memory of her hands inside that frozen box. How small and red they must have been, and my heart tightened with the memory of my own hands months ago. The warehouse was quiet except for the echo of her voice and the hum of the lights, and each sound from inside the freezer sharpened me, focusing every thought until the only thing left was this singular equation. She will know what it felt like to be helpless. Time stretched awkwardly. I measured it by the way her calls changed from orderly sentences to breathless pleas. At first she asked if I was joking, then she demanded I open the door, and finally she cried. Raw, unfiltered, the sound I once heard as a child when she had fallen and scraped her knees, but now edged with a new terror I had never wanted to hear from her again. My fingers tightened around the cigarette until I felt the burn, and I reminded myself of the promise I had made in the cold. Not to destroy her life, but to teach her a lesson she couldn't shrug away. After a long while, long enough that her voice had grown thin and ragged, I spoke. I didn't shout or rage. I spoke like someone reading out a verdict. I told her I remembered the exact day she had sealed my fate, the way she had laughed quietly and walked away. I said I had thought a lot about what justice looks like, and that what I wanted wasn't blood but understanding. Her responses came in fits, words tumbled out. Apologies, accusations, insinuations that I was cruel, that I was making a mistake. But they had the frantic quality of someone grasping for anything solid. I let her grasp. My silence was part of the pressure. I thought of the nights I had spent watching her small acts of paranoia, how her world had become a house of cracked glass, and I decided to give her a mirror to see herself in. I didn't tell her everything I had planned. There was no theater in confession. Instead, I asked questions she had never had to answer. Why had she wanted me gone? What was the hole inside her that made cruelty feel like an answer? Whether she had ever felt the nausea of regret since that night. Her breathing hitched on each question, as if the cold itself had crawled into her chest. At one point she sobbed so hard she collapsed into a heap on the floor, the sound muffled by the insulated walls, and I felt a strange looseness inside me. An old tenderness that had been frozen under layers of fury. For a second I pictured pulling her into my arms and comforting her, letting all the damage of those years dissolve into something softer, but that tenderness would undo the lesson. It would let her hide behind apologies and crocodile tears, and I could not let that happen. Instead I told her I would open the door when she could answer clearly. What did she think love meant between siblings, and how did she justify trying to erase me from a life we shared? The questions weren't traps, exactly. They were invitations to face the emptiness that had made her capable of locking a person away. I heard her murmur answers, self-justifications, stories of feeling overlooked, of rage at comparisons. And when the words came, they sounded small and shabby against the industrial chill. She blamed everything outside herself, and that blamed echoed hollowly in the box. The time we had spent together as children, riding bikes, sharing secrets, felt both near and impossibly far away. I had loved her once with a naive, inexhaustible loyalty, and I kept waiting for that old love to flicker back in her voice. Not exactly. What came were apologies tangled with excuses, and the raw, shuddering tremor of someone who had been caught and could no longer pretend. Finally, when the panic in her cries had ebbed into trembling acceptance, when she understood that I wouldn't be fooled by tears alone, I turned the latch and opened the door. The smell of cold rushed out like a living thing, and she stumbled into my arms, shaking, wrapped in a blanket of frost that clung to her hair. I held her for a long time, not out of mercy but because the physical reality of her in my arms made the lesson real for both of us. She was small against me, shivering not just from cold but from something deeper, an exhaustion that comes when you have been stripped of defenses and forced to look at yourself. I didn't raise my voice or castigate her in front of the uncle or our parents who would eventually hear the story in filtered fragments. Instead I told her simply that she had a choice now. To get help, to confess honestly to everyone who mattered, to rebuild whatever trust could be rebuilt, or to keep living in a world where fear dictated her actions and she might one day take a step she could never come back from. Her eyes found mine, glassy but clear in a way I hadn't seen since we were children, and there was a flicker. Maybe remorse, maybe a dawning understanding. She nodded slowly, the gesture of someone who finally understands that fate is not something you steal from others but something you shape with every decision. We walked out of the freezer together, the night air feeling unusually warm against our cheeks, and though nothing about our lives would be simple again, the power between us had shifted. I had not broken her. I had given her back a piece of reality she had tried to deny. Whether she would use that piece to heal or to harden would be her choice, but for the first time since that night months ago, I felt the cold inside me begin to thaw. In the days that followed the warehouse night, silence wrapped itself around our house like a heavy fog, not the ordinary silence of routine but the kind that carries unspoken truths, the kind that hums beneath every word and glance. My sister moved carefully through the rooms, as though afraid the walls themselves might remember what had happened. Her shoulders hunched, her eyes lowered whenever I was near, and yet she did not avoid me completely as she once might have. Something had shifted. The arrogance that once fueled her cruelty was gone, replaced by a nervous humility, fragile and trembling, as if she had been remade in the cold and was now learning how to live in her new skin. She no longer laughed too loudly to mask her discomfort, no longer tossed careless remarks at me in front of our parents, no longer carried that gleam of superiority in her stare. Instead, she lingered quietly, speaking less, observing more, like a shadow who had learned what it meant to be afraid of the light. At first I wondered if it was all another performance, if she would slip back into her old patterns once the fear softened, but as the days stretched into weeks, I began to realize that the freezer had done what words, lectures, and punishments never could. It had made her understand. She avoided lying, avoided cheap excuses, and though she never confessed openly to our parents what she had done to me, she did change in ways they noticed, helping more around the house, asking less for herself, softening in her tone with them. To them it was maturity, a late blooming of responsibility, but I knew better. It wasn't maturity. It was survival. The lesson burned into her veins that cruelty carries consequences she could never bear again. Still, I carried the memory of her sobs inside the freezer, the way her voice broke, the way her body collapsed against the floor, and I knew those scars were not mine to erase. I did not feel triumph as much as I expected, nor the blazing satisfaction of revenge fulfilled. Instead, I felt something heavier, something that lived deeper in my chest, a mixture of sorrow and acceptance. I had forced her to face what she had done, but in doing so, I had carried myself to the edge of something darker, a place where power and cruelty could look too similar, and I was not blind to that danger. Nights were the hardest, because when I closed my eyes I could still see her shivering form stumbling out of the freezer, could still feel the tremble of her frame when I caught her in my arms, and I wondered if some part of me had become like her in order to defeat her. The thought gnawed at me, whispering that perhaps there was no true justice, only cycles of pain passed back and forth between those who share blood. And yet, when I saw her folding laundry without complaint, when I caught her silently washing dishes long after everyone else had gone to bed, when I noticed the way she sometimes glanced at me not with hatred but with quiet recognition, I understood that maybe cycles could be broken if the lesson was harsh enough to change the heart. She never spoke of the night, never asked me why I did it, never dared to use words to bridge the gap between us, but the silence itself became a language we both understood. She knew I had spared her when I could have destroyed her, and I knew she had tasted enough of fear to never again cross the line she once believed she could. Our parents remained blissfully unaware, caught in their own small worlds, proud of what they thought was a blossoming bond between us, unaware that beneath the surface our story had twisted and burned into something they would never fully comprehend. Time moved on as it always does, but we were not the same siblings we once were. We were bound now by something deeper than love or rivalry, by a memory we could never erase. Sometimes when I looked at her across the table, I wondered if she hated me for what I had done, if she lay awake at night reliving her own suffocating terror, and if she despised me the way I once despised her. But then she would meet my gaze, and there would be no hatred, only a quiet, resigned respect, a recognition that she had been spared from her worst fate not by her own strength but by mine. I don't know if forgiveness is the right word for what lay between us, because forgiveness suggests something clean and whole, and what we shared was neither clean nor whole. It was fractured, scarred, but it was real. And real, I realized, was better than the fake smiles and poisoned laughter we had once endured. Years from now, people may look at us and see only siblings who lived ordinary lives, who argued sometimes, who supported each other other times, who walked side by side into adulthood. They will never know the darkness we carried, the freezer that nearly killed me, the night I gave her a glimpse of her own cruelty turned back against her. But she will know, and I will know, and that knowledge will sit between us like a shadow and a bond, unshakable, undeniable. I don't regret what I did, though I understand the cost. I know I stepped into the cold part of myself to do it, and I know I could never explain it to anyone else without sounding like a monster, but I also know that monsters don't stop cycles. They feed them. I stopped it. I ended the war between us by showing her the battlefield she had created, by letting her feel the frost she had once sentenced me to. And now, though our house is quieter, though our laughter is rarer, there is peace. Not the peace of innocence, but the peace of survival, the peace of knowing that fate no longer belongs to her cruelty or to my silence but to the choice we both made when we walked out of that warehouse alive. She has not locked another door since, not even the door of her room, and sometimes when I pass by at night, I see her asleep with the hallway light glowing, her face softened by rest, And I realize she sleeps not because she feels safe, but because she knows the person she once betrayed is the very same person who decided to let her live with her lesson instead of dying with her sin. That, in the end, is enough for me. The story ends not with revenge or triumph, but with balance. The kind of balance forged only in fire and ice, in betrayal and survival. My sister tried to freeze me out of existence, but I came back, and in coming back I did more than survive. I chose her fate, and in choosing it I chose my own. Backhand index pointing right. If you enjoyed this twisted story, don't forget to like, share, and drop your thoughts in the comments. Backhand index pointing right. Subscribe to Twisted Fate Chronicle for more shocking stories that will keep you hooked till the end.